Hi folks, and thanks for coming to my first new video of the year. My name's Gheeotine, and welcome to the Gaming Gheeotine, where I extol the excellent and execute the poorly executed. And speaking of poorly executed, I really think nvidia needs to bring forth an explanation for the whole 50 series launch debacle this past week. As someone who is at most on the fence on whether or not to drop the substantial scratch on a 5080, the mixture of paltry supply, incoming tariffs, reviews showing lackluster performance increases over the last generation, and the parasitic scum practice of scalping has left me completely cold on thoughts of arguably necessary upgrades. I say arguably necessary because I typically game in 1440p and my current card, the AMD 7900 GRE Hellhound, is one of the better cards you can have for playing at that resolution. At my current level, a 5080 would be at best overkill. Anyway, cutting-edge hardware, while nice to have, isn't necessary to have a fun experience, and I'm finding that indulging in obscure or eccentric older hardware is actually pretty fun in and of itself, which leads me to yet another build I started for the sake of experimentation and discovery. Yet again, I find I need to be exceptionally careful when watching Linus Tech Tips videos, because if Linus does something, I might get lured into wanting to use one of his videos as a jumping-off point. Last time, it was a $69 gaming PC challenge, and today, I decided to indulge in the pinnacle of performance from around 2015 to 2016. In his video titled, "How Bad Is This $10,000 PC from 10 Years Ago?", Linus and crew built one of the most absurd machines from 2014 with 2 CPUs, and the part I found most fascinating, 4-way SLI. However, in the video, they speculated that they were being restrained by the fact that the 2 CPUs caused delays and overhead on processing speeds, and even the DDR3 RAM may have been holding things back. Now, I restrained the intrusive thoughts for a while, but eventually I began researching parts, and by that point, there was little helping me. A build was gonna happen, so with all that out of the way, let's get to business and check out some parts. Starting with the main piece, or pieces that prompted me to get into my specific brand of madness, we begin with the graphics card, or in this case, cards. 4 of them. That's right, we're using 4 NVIDIA GeForce 6GB GTX 980 Ti's. These are the flagship of the 9th generation of GTX cards. They're still getting driver updates at the time I wrote this script, and considering I recently covered and illustrated the viability of the GTX 960, a card that's 3 performance tiers below the 980 Ti, I think it's reasonable to still view it as a respectable piece of hardware, even if running just one. That being said, again, we're running 4. Moving on to the next part, running 4 cards means I need a platform that can facilitate this kind of madness, and I just happened to stumble across an eBay listing that laid out brilliant foundations. Barring the fan on the CPU radiator, I bought this assembly like this. The parts consist of an i7 6900K with 8 cores and 16 threads that turbo to a max of 3.7 GHz, 8 sticks of 8GB 2400 DDR4 RAM, a knock to a CPU cooler radiator, and all plugged into a Gigabyte GA X99P SLI motherboard. For a time, I was just looking, but when the seller lowered the already decent price in a private deal, my fate was kind of sealed. Considering it was only running a single CPU, and the DDR4 RAM would cause less overhead, I had a good feeling. Additionally, while it may be nothing but marketing hype, this motherboard advertised advantages of its specific platform over other 4-way SLI boards. Something I guess we'll have to see, not that I have much of a basis of comparison. My next concern was how I was going to power this behemoth of a machine. Considering most wattage calculators said I'd be drawing between 12 and 1400 watts at peak performance, I opted for this beast, the EVGA Supernova 1600. I think the presence this thing emanates speaks for itself. Also, I have to mention that I'm really happy my rent includes electricity, and I kinda hope my landlord doesn't watch my videos. Since I have cats, I rarely do open-air builds lest my CPU coolers start spewing hairballs. That means I needed a case with the power to hold chaos akin to Pandora's box. Favoring a simple utilitarian style, I bought the Fantex Enthoo Pro Series PHES3614P BK. Plenty of room and plenty of places to put fans. With the acquisition of a 4-way SLI bridge and a Silicon Power 2TB Gen 3 NVMe SSD, as the board only supports Gen 3, it was time for assembly. Before putting everything together though, let's highlight one last detail. The price. Back when most of these parts were new, the motherboard was about $200 alone, each GTX 980 Ti ran about $650, the i7-6900K was almost $1,100, the power supply would have been about $340, a 2TB NVMe SSD was around $300, and 8 8GB RAM sticks would have been around another $340. Keeping the same cost for a case, we have a machine that, in 2016, would have run you around $5,000. Price-wise, this was a 1% top-tier performance machine, and I assembled this today for around 1/6 of that price. Interesting to think about, right? Moving on so I could see what to expect, I first assembled it with just one 980 Ti. After installing Windows 11 and a healthy library of SLI compatible games, I ran some bench tests and the results had me pretty excited. Starting with Cyberpunk 2077, I more just wanted to see what to expect from games that don't support SLI. Yeah, Cyberpunk doesn't support it to any meaningful degree. That being said, with high presets at 1080p, the benchmark ran around 55 FPS. After Cyberpunk though, all bench tests I ran were with games that do support SLI. Starting with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we saw a maximum frame rate of around 126, with an average of 74 and a minimum of 51. Pretty good. Grand Theft Auto 5, a game I very much want to play if for no other reason than to get it off of my plate, ran at a stable 60 FPS on high settings. I need to stress though that this was one card. Not to give away spoilers for later in the video, but this benchmark proved interesting if nothing else. Far Cry 5, a game I'm planning on replaying for another project related to this machine, was another refreshing result, running an average of 80 FPS with the minimum sitting around 74. With the presets rammed all the way to Ultra. Deus Ex Mankind Divided was another good foundation, averaging 72 frames per second with a high of 98 and a low of 62. Considering the detail-oriented focus of the test, I was encouraged. Finally, let's round up the single card section with a trifecta of SLI-compatible racing games: Dirt 3, Dirt Rally, and Grid 2. All three broke 120 FPS, with Dirt 3 and Grid 2 both going over 200 for their highs. Damn impressive for a decade-old graphics card if you ask me. With that last bit of context, I'd say the results are all around impressive. The 980 Ti is turning 10 this year, again, is still receiving driver support, and as illustrated here can still handle most games with relative ease. Yeah, the 6GB RAM limit might cause an issue or two, and it doesn't support ray tracing, but I'd still game on one, especially for $85, the average cost of what I paid for these today. So with a base level of performance set by a single GTX 980 Ti, I then began the process of adding all the other cards, cable routing, and other final assembly. However, much to my chagrin, it turned out to be far more of a process than just the physical assembly. With 2 cards, I was fine. The biggest problem was, once I tried to add cards 3 and 4, I just couldn't get it to boot. Side note, I actually ordered 8 cards in anticipation of getting some bad ones. To a degree, that gamble did pay off because one card ended up dead on arrival, and another got cancelled without me knowing why. So if you try something like this yourself, a 25% margin of failure or other issues for the card seemed to be my experience. Anyway, after testing all the cards on an individual basis, and then testing all the PCIe slots also on an individual basis, I was eventually able to boil it down to 2 issues. One hardware or an unspecified software issue. And honestly, the hardware would have been so much easier. For that, I was thinking that maybe I just had a bad SLI bridge. Annoying, but very fixable. Placing an order for the replacement, I moved on to resolving potential software issues. Running the computer with one card, I booted into the BIOS and began researching settings. About an hour of finding different individual settings, researching them, changing them, shutting down, reassembling with 4 cards, starting up, seeing no change, shutting down again, removing 3 of the cards, booting to BIOS again, lather, rinse, repeat. Alright, I've been working on this monstrosity for the past 2 hours. After, having more than 2 cards in the thing wouldn't cause it to work, I've elected to just have this be the final boot attempt for the night, and if not, I'm going to come back to this another day. Updated the BIOS, manually set the generation of PCIe to Gen 3, and then slapped all the cards back in. I've had it 2 previously, that worked. Before the BIOS update, anything more than 2 would not work, so I am done. So is Bill. Alright. Alright. Whoa, the green lights. Whoa. Always. Alright. Come on. Come on. Turn green. Do it. Oh. Oh. Ladies and gentlemen, we have boot. Yes. Ha, it's running. And the bridge is not bad. 4-way SLI. Ha! Success. Finally swallowing the bite that was definitely more than I was expecting to chew, I could finally get the computer set up to game on. Spending the next day downloading a whole bunch more SLI-compatible games, I then dove into a bunch of bench tests to see how they compared to running a single card. The results were not what I was expecting. I did run Cyberpunk 2077 again, just to validate that the 3 other cards weren't going to be used at all, and yeah, the readings pretty much showed that they powered on just enough to be on standby. So let's move on to the other games. Starting again with Grand Theft Auto 5 revealed some of the main issues with SLI, except multiply it by 4. The bench test didn't even work. By technicality, it was running, but in the same sense that a car belching black smoke can be considered running. The display showed nothing but a frame counter and an occasional light effect, all while the sound effects of the scenarios in the test still played out. So, seeing the test was rendered fairly useless, I opted to try playing for a few minutes. This was much better in the sense that the game actually ran. Well, most of the time. In confined spaces or areas you were mostly on foot, the game ran smooth and had no problems. In a car, though, I encountered the bane of SLI: micro stutters. For the unfamiliar, micro stutters happen when the cards can't maintain a consistent timing on frame delivery. In a 4-way SLI machine, this can happen so much more. Each card has to render a frame and then deliver it in a 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence, and if one gets hung up, it can become noticeable very fast. So, while playable, I don't think I'll be knocking GTA 5 off of my gaming bucket list with this machine. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was honestly kind of a mess. It micro-stuttered to hell for about a quarter of the bench test, hated the SLI monitoring bar, and even though the numbers for highs, lows, and averages were better across the board, and at a higher resolution, it felt horrible to experience. I can only imagine the irritation of playing it. Moving back to Far Cry 5, things got better and also worse. The maximum frame rate at 1080p increased by about 40%, honestly some pretty terrible scaling for 4 cards, but the average hardly went up at all, and if anything the lows showed that 4 cards is less stable, falling to 60 when we were previously at 74. Actually, speaking of stability, that's another thing to take a brief tangent on. Just because I managed to get the machine to boot, that didn't mean I could do so reliably. Even after continuing to muck about with BIOS settings, this behemoth of a machine only reliably boots about 2/3 of the time. The other 1/3, you have to do the PC equivalent of smothering an elderly relative with a pillow and hold down the power button until things stop running. Then press the button again and hope things start properly this time. Getting back to the bench tests, Deus Ex threw hissy fits until I ran it at my native display resolution of 1440p, when before I was running at 1080p, so going forward all the tests are now in 1440p. Yeah, it may taint some results, but it illustrates use cases. Anyway, Deus Ex scaled alright, but the average FPS still went down by about 20% and the minimum FPS was less than half, although the highest frame rate was also higher than before. Consequently, the only way to exit the bench test was to Alt F4 the game. So, simultaneously a better and worse result. Honestly, I don't know what to expect from this machine anymore. Breaking down the racing titles into their own individual bench tests, Dirt 3 at 1440p on Ultra saw a 50 FPS hit to performance. That being said, percentage-wise, it wasn't terrible, only seeing a 20 to 25% dip for a 50% increase in resolution. Plus, I'd say 135 FPS as a minimum is pretty damn good on any day that ends in Y. That is, until the stability issues popped up again. Dirt 3 is an extinct game, so you can't easily get it new on PC outside of YAR methods, so I get it not having ongoing support. However, it behaves like a possessive and bipolar girlfriend if you try and leave. Trying to shut down or exit the game basically reduced the rig to a shivering mess, forcing another pillow smother restart. Dirt Rally scaled pretty similarly to Dirt 3 at the same resolution and level of detail, but also experienced the same quirks of Deus Ex in that the highs were higher, but the lows were also lower. Not to the same degree, but interesting to observe. Grid 2 might have been the best showing of maintaining performance after adding more cards and upscaling the resolution, seeing a consistent 20% lower FPS but 50% higher resolution on the highest detail, with the minimum still being over 100 frames per second. So there's the results of some bench tests and a little gameplay to supplement the GTA 5 test being next to useless. However, bench tests are only so useful. Yeah, they serve a purpose in comparisons as a fairly sterile and repeatable tool, but how about gameplay? Well, I'm pleased to say that I got some good time in with a few titles to try some real game performance outside of GTA 5. Let's start with Dirt 3 again. Buttery smoothness. That's all I can say. Outside of the aforementioned issues with trying to shut down the game, I would absolutely love playing this game exclusively on this machine. Whether it was city arena tracks or courses navigating the deserts of Africa, nothing looked bad. I've got plenty more titles to try, and my reference for games is limited so far, but I feel like SLI and racing titles might just vibe with each other. But let's try another title. Dishonored on max settings at 1440 looked pretty good. Now, in some environments, it's not a perfect experience, but after a while, I was just playing it. I completely forgot that I was looking for microstutters or stability issues. In fact, I'm full-blown just doing another playthrough at this point. It's a good game, and Arcane seems to have made a title that scales well over multiple GPUs. But, at the request of one person in a PC building group I'm a member of, and out of my own morbid curiosity, I decided the final title on this video's featured tests would be both popular and infamous. Everyone knows about Bethesda jank, and whether it's an Elder Scrolls title or today's feature of Fallout 4, it's widely understood that things often feel like they're held together with duct tape and spit. I was expecting, at best, something akin to GTA 5, playable but choppy. What I got was beyond my imagination. The microstutters barely microstuttered. In interior spaces and corridors at 1440p, the frame rate never sunk below 140. In the open world, 60 was the minimum, and 90 was the average. I mean, maybe this computer and Fallout 4 were just made for each other. I could describe either the game or the PC as unstable, unwieldy, power-hungry, buggy, temperamental, and impressive, and you wouldn't know which thing I was talking about. This computer is trying to break me in new and exciting ways, and I am all for it. But before I conclude, let's calm down and relay a few of my observations, along with a point or two I want to make. First and foremost, I can absolutely confirm that the performance scaling does not justify the cost or resources needed for 4 cards. Frame rate wise, you likely would have seen similar or slightly better performance with just 2 cards, barring one small detail. I could be wrong on this, but scaling to 3 or 4 cards instead of increasing performance balances and lessens the workload on each individual card. Looking at Fallout 4, it was rare for any individual card to go above 50% utilization, also meaning that temperatures were well within safe operational limits. On games that don't support SLI, well, the 3 extra graphics cards are pretty much useless. One card will be cooking itself while the rest just sit there like 3 lazy high school students coasting on a school project while the nerdy kid does all the work. I could theoretically use this thing for crypto mining, but that landscape is a raw hellhole I want less to do with the more I learn. At the end of the day, this is still an enthusiast-level machine, but more for exploring interesting and defunct avenues the gaming industry has since stopped following. But before I sign out for the day, I want to again highlight some comparisons of the past week, especially in lieu of the NVIDIA 50 series launch debacle. That last point is, while old, 980 Ti's and many other components are still quite usable and fun, if for alternative reasoning. Someone out there may be thinking that they need a 50 series card because it's the latest and, finger quotes, greatest available. But if your goal is to game, what's wrong with your current hardware? Not only that, but with the prevalence of scalpers, a sense of desperation or FOMO can only cause you to feed into a dual asshole system. The assholes who scalp, and the assholes who facilitate the scalpers. Short of a professional reason, no one needs a 50 series card. Be patient and you'll not only have a chance to get one, but you'll be able to more thoroughly enjoy your current hardware. And I intend to enjoy this machine further. See, I'm not dismantling this machine once the video is done. I have quite the list of SLI compatible games, and I intend to play most of these. So now, going forward, I announce 2025 as the year of tribute to SLI. I won't exclusively be playing these games, but I will be using this rig whenever I can for retro game reviews, or if I have projects that may refer to any of the titles on screen. And with that, I once again welcome you to 2025. Let's see what gaming has for us this year. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm probably going to be deployed on a business trip for the next few weeks, but I don't intend on missing an upload. So, I have some planning to do. Hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. Remember that I give away Steam keys with my regular weekly uploads, and all you have to do to enter is leave a comment and have contact info on your YouTube profile. But as always, thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.